So Jim said that we are in the educational business, right? And part of that business of educating is preparing our students to operate as effective citizens in a global marketplace. How are we doing that in online, continuing, and professional education? How are we preparing them in that regard? He showed some funny pictures about how we view kind of higher education. I came from Rochester, New York. How many of you are familiar with Kodak, right? What was Kodak's biggest downfall? Right? Yeah, they didn't adapt, right? It went from 65,000 employees, where it was said that every other neighbor was a Kodak employee, to less than 1,000, right? Because they didn't adapt. And so we're recognizing that even as we are adapting in online, continuing professional kind of education spaces, there is a need, there is a thirst, there is a hunger by our students to be able to be prepared for the marketplace that awaits. You cannot have that interaction without some level of connection to diversity and inclusion. And so I think it's incumbent upon us in the academic space to be able to prepare that. This continuum was developed by Christopher Metzler. Christopher Metzler was a faculty member at Cornell when he developed this, and he said that he's since moved on, but he said that our organizations are at any one point along this continuum in their own diversity and inclusion journey, right? They're either monocultural organization, kind of typified by one perspective, a level of homogeneity, one aspect of compositional diversity may be dominating the organization. They're a compliant organization, really that's doing the bare minimum to stay out of legal trouble. There are multicultural organizations that's figured out how to celebrate diversity and differences within their organization, but maybe they haven't figured out how to fully utilize it ultimately to move the organization forward, or they're this utopic environment, they are an inclusive environment that has really figured out how to leverage, how to optimize, how to utilize those differences to move the organization forward. And I think this really just ties a bow on it. Diversity is the mix, and inclusion is making the mix work. So what's the motivation? I've talked about some of it, right? We also know in our higher ed spaces, agencies like the NIH and NSF are asking for greater intentionality with regard to grant proposals. We know that our demographics are changing in our spaces. But I like what this faculty member said. This is Scott Page, a faculty member at the University of Michigan. He has 2 books out. His research in the difference has shown how diverse teams and perspectives and compositional diversity outperform homogeneous ones time and time again. And he says that innovation depends as much on collective difference as on aggregate ability. So if people think alike, then no matter how smart they are, they most likely will get stuck at the same locally optimal peaks. So finding new and better solutions requires thinking differently. And that's why diversity powers innovation. So I'm going to take a stab that none of you have joined your organizations because you thought that they were the most mediocre organizations that you could find, right? You joined them because you thought they had some aspect of excellence, or that you brought some aspect of individual excellence that you thought would enhance the company or the organization and move it forward. What we basically say in the diversity and inclusion space that you can't achieve the level of organizational individual excellence you're seeking unless you look around every corner to see what role diversity and inclusion should or shouldn't play in that regard. And so ultimately, to achieve that level of organizational excellence or individual excellence, you have to meaningfully connect, inextricably bind your diversity and inclusion efforts with your organizational and individual pursuits of excellence to achieve this notion of inclusive excellence. And these are just aspects of inclusive excellence. And there could be more that you think of, right, in your own spaces. I'm thinking about notions of sense of belonging, which is huge, right? When we think about sense of community and sense of belonging and its impact on academic performance and persistence and graduation. Notions about resources or dialogue, notions of identity, which is huge with our students nowadays, and notions of intersectionality. So how does this play out in our educational spaces? How can you better leverage some of these opportunities and needs to better enhance the educational experiences for our students in our online, professional, and continuing education spaces? So the fundamental question, I think, that presents ourselves after all of that information are our diversity and inclusion efforts meaningfully connected to our organizational and individual interests? And recognizing that motivation often drives strategy, and that any goal that you have without a plan is simply a wish. An important strategy in the field of diversity and inclusion is ultimately identifying a roadmap, some breadcrumbs that you can follow to move this work forward. And in our space, we say that you need to move that work forward by connecting it meaningfully to areas of organizational functioning. Gone are the days of just ultimately suggesting that there's just a moral imperative behind this work. And gone are the days, quite simply, of attempting to do diversity and inclusion work on the periphery and being satiated by that effort. So we've identified basically 4, and some places even identified 5 areas of organizational functioning. The Inclusive Excellence Framework, the notion of inclusive excellence was identified by the American Association of Colleges and Universities back in 2005, where they commissioned a number of scholars who came up with a number of different monographs. This work for me is informed also by Daryl Smith, who has a wonderful book out called Diversity's Promise in Higher Education, Making It Work. So I'll offer that to you as a resource. But the 4 areas of organizational functioning, I'll add a 5th, are access and success for faculty, staff, and students, campus climate and intergroup relations, education and scholarship, and the institutional infrastructure. Access and success, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but what are those pipelines to our educational spaces and ultimately the supportive pillars that we've identified to help faculty, staff, and students navigate those spaces with some levels of success. Campus climate and intergroup relations has played out itself for sure on the Mizzou campus. What are those perceptions of the organizational environment, and how can those be enhanced to increase levels of sense of belonging and sense of community that really help out the entire campus community. Education and scholarship, I've already talked about that, right? Preparing our students for the global marketplace that awaits, and how do we support our faculty, our staff, the modalities that we use to achieve that, to meaningfully connect our students to this space and prepare them for the marketplace that awaits. And then the institutional infrastructure, looking at our policies, our processes, our practices, the people that make them go, and the meaningful connection to diversity and inclusion that serves as a help and not a hindrance to this work. A 5th area that many organizations are adding is community engagement. There's a recognition that there sometimes can be a disconnect between an institution and the town gown, opportunities for more community engagement, both for students, for faculty and staff, and the institution as a whole. And for me, coming out here, that's where this journey has really begun for me, because probably, I don't know, last October, the October before that, I was taken to lunch by leaders in the local community in Columbia. There were heads of Shelter Insurance and Central Bank of Boone County, the Columbia School District, Chamber of Commerce. There was a loan accountant in that meeting. I don't know if that was the best accountant in Columbia or not, but that person was there as well. And they wanted to know more about the vision that we had for moving this work forward. And so I was able to talk about the Inclusive Excellence Framework, but they said, you know, when the protest happened at Mizzou, we were chagrined because we really wanted to come together as a community and really help. We were ready to roll up our sleeves, and we felt that the UM system and Mizzou insulated themselves from the community. So we don't want you to leave this lunch until you give us some bold idea of how we can have a better connection in this diversity and inclusion space with the institution. I said, okay, well, you know, thinking on my feet, and wanting to be invited back to a future lunch, I said, well, what if we rewrote this Inclusive Excellence Framework? What if we removed the higher ed references and allowed it to serve as a backdrop for our city and our county and parts of the state? What if we became the nation's first inclusive excellence city, right? And they didn't laugh me out the room. They actually thought it had merit, and so they connected me with designees in their organization, and that's what we did. We rewrote the framework for the city and the county, and now it's, you know, we presented it in the governor's office and parts of the state. We've partnered with Extension. We still look at access and success, right, for the demographic that is and the constituents that are being served. Organizational environment and intergroup relations, some of the same things that are there and our expected needs of organizations, training and education, the organizational infrastructure, and again, looking at community engagement. And it has been amazing to see how this has taken off. This is my 5th higher ed stop. I've worked in metropolitan areas like Maryland, DC, and yet and still, I've never seen a community come together like they have in the Columbia community in Boone County, and quite honestly, parts of the state and even neighboring states that have just garnered an interest. So much so now we're having visits by Lafayette, Louisiana, and Knoxville, Tennessee, because they want to ultimately build this stronger connection and utilize this notion of a framework. Again, this notion of what gets measured gets done. And so these are collaborative partners today, just thinking about organizations that have just connected to this work throughout aspects of the state. I have to add more now, even in governor's office that have just joined in. I just presented to the Department of Revenue and Department of Social Services. And so it's been fantastic to see what we can do when we come together. I share that for you to think about UPCEA, to think about your respective organizations, and to not look at diversity and inclusion as a one-off. Right? How do you ultimately incorporate this so it becomes, it's woven into the fabric of who you are as an organization, who you are as an institution? This is not just the work of a chief diversity officer or someone associated with this, right? How you ultimately make this a part of your planning process to deliver the best content, to deliver the best services as it relates to online continuing ed and professional education. So I just want to talk a little bit and kind of tailor some of this now to your spaces. Access and success. One of the things that's being talked about now, I've really been talked about for a while now, Michigan State has really led the charge in this, is this notion of the T-shaped graduate and the T-shaped professional, right? Those students, those accessing our academic knowledge, right, with the discipline-specific, the vertical part of that T, but also this horizontal notion of the softer skills, interpersonal communication skills, teamwork, communication, perspective building, thinking critically and globally, right? How can we incorporate that into our online professional and continuing educational offerings? Are we doing it? At the end, I'm happy to take questions, but it's also a wonderful opportunity for you to share some of your promising practices that you may already be doing within your respective institutions. This is important, this is key, and so my question would be, if we're not doing this, we need to be, right, to prepare our students for that. This is a wonderful opportunity to engage in that manner. I want to share this. This is from Deloitte. This is what Deloitte is looking at. Deloitte has, first of all, is a leader in the diversity and inclusion space from a business and industry standpoint. They basically have identified 6 signature traits of an inclusive leader. I share this because this is how we should be preparing our students, again, for that marketplace that awaits, right? They want employees that have curiosity, cultural intelligence, are able to collaborate, right? This notion of a commitment, courage, and cognizance, right? Recognizing the biases that are there. So how are we incorporating, some of these we can incorporate, how are we incorporating those into our educational spaces and offerings throughout, and how are maybe we championing that from UPCEA, right? To serve as resources for the organizations that want to be able to grapple with that to prepare our students. So under education and scholarship, I just want to spend a little bit of time just as I was researching this kind of topic to share with you. I came across some information I think is valuable, and I want to start and share that. I want to start just utilizing online education just as a placeholder here, but I like what Clay Shirky said in his 2015 article, "The digital revolution in higher education has already happened and no one noticed." Clay notes that the non-traditional student has become the traditional student in online education. They did not enroll in college immediately upon graduating high school. They're 25 years or older. They have dependent children or elders. They tend to be enrolled part-time, usually work full-time, do not live on campus. And then additional considerations are this recognition that our efforts have to be there to increase accessibility for those with diverse abilities, or those who live in, this is huge in Missouri, rural areas that don't have access. Right, so rural and urban areas that may not easily have access, right, to online educational offerings. I provide this again just as note that we have diverse representation that are taking part in our course offerings. And given that diversity representation, what are we doing to ultimately meet that need, but what are we doing also to tap into those lived experiences to enhance the experiences of all who take those educational offerings. Obiageli Sneed is a senior instructional designer at Arizona State University, and she identified some strategies for kind of thinking about the diversity inclusion space. She applied this to kind of online education, but it really is applicable to all of those areas. how do you know your student audience, right? Having this good connection or understanding of your course's kind of student population is essential to moving toward becoming a more culturally aware. So how do we engage with that perspective? Do you know that? I mean, what is the domestic or international representation taking that course? Reasons why they enrolled, multilingual, bilingual, cultural backgrounds kind of represented, these lived experiences that are incredibly important for those students, but quite honestly could be incredibly important for the class experience. Have you reviewed the course activities for cultural awareness and sensitivity? This is big. We have just started, we have a Center for Teaching and Learning up and on the ground now, and so I want to thank Jim Spain for his efforts in that regard. That was one of the things when I came, we didn't have that, and many of your institutions do, but it's a wonderful way to kind of engage faculty that, or even incentivize faculty to make their courses and their curriculum more inclusive. So we launched some efforts in that regard, but how are you reflective on those courses to make sure that there is an awareness and a knowledge of the kind of cultural backgrounds of your students, but also that could ultimately impact the curricular offerings that you put forth? Tap into your students' backgrounds and cultures and experiences. Past lived experiences allow students to make deeper connections to the course curriculum. I put here at the University of Michigan because some years ago I remember a representative from the University of Michigan mentioning to me about how in their math department, over their calculus, they would put their calculus word problems, they would put ultimately diversity and inclusion fact patterns for students because they believed that that it would impact particularly the diverse student population engagement with the material. Well, what they found was that the learning outcomes of all the students went up, right? But in particular, those diverse students in the population of those classes, because they were able to better connect and make meaning of those word problems because they tailored them. They were like, wait a minute, I've encountered this in Detroit or Southeast DC. I get this now. This makes sense to me. So ultimately, thinking about the lived experiences, the backgrounds of those taking the course, how do we meaningfully connect that in a way that enhances the learning experience? And sometimes there are even common connections among the student cultures and backgrounds that can enhance the learning of everyone and create these new bonds that I think are important. I just think about that particularly around our online offerings as well. Strive to create a safe, trustworthy, and positive teaching and learning environment. The absence of that can provide and prevent and preclude students from kind of engaging with the course content, connecting with the community of learners. So just thinking about that. And then I just want to share this as a resource, the Multicultural Pavilion, thinking about edchange.org. Paul Gorski is a former colleague at the University of Maryland at College Park who spent his life's work as a faculty member and a scholar wanting to equip faculty with just opportunities to engage in these kind of multicultural spaces. And I think he has a wealth of resources and information at the Multicultural Pavilion. So if you just Google that, you'll be able to potentially find some of that helpful as you move forward. So thinking about your professional education, continuing education, and online education, I think this thing kind of rings true, right? Tell me and I'll forget, teach me and I'll remember, involve me and I'll learn. How are we engaging our students? Not just the amazing content that you develop, but are we doing it in ways that are relevant to those that are participating in those workshops and those courses? And then how do you assess that work, right? This organizational infrastructure, I just focus on kind of the assessment part of that, being intentional around incorporation of that diversity and inclusion, but how do you ultimately assess it? How do you identify goals, objectives, strategies, and indicators for doing this work that it allows you to kind of annually assess whether we're meeting those goals or not? These are the things that you hope with regard to the framework, whatever framework you might already identify with, that you impact: the personal, the interpersonal, the cultural, and the institutional. But there are always buts in diversity and inclusion work, right? There are some who are very comfortable with the status quo and where you all probably are currently, right? And those that want to move this work forward. It's a recognition that it has its challenges. I like this here. There's often resistance to change. What if we don't change at all and something magically just happens? And I think that was Kodak's approach, and it didn't work out very well for them. I want you to find a bold and innovative way to do everything exactly the same way it's been done for the last 25 years, right? I think Jim's example pointed out, we can't do that. We don't have that luxury in higher education. When asked, would you rather work for change or just complain, 81% of the respondents replied, do I have to pick? Right? This is so incredibly hard, right? Oftentimes priorities change, right? Sometimes diversity inclusion is in vogue now, maybe it's not in vogue tomorrow. We know there's a lot in our higher ed spaces, a lack of resources, or maybe it's just a lack of resourcefulness. But what I appreciate about what I've learned from UPCEA thus far and many of the institutions represented here today is that there's great intention and a desire for great outcomes, right? I think our goal is to make sure we do not get stuck in this very technical term, this abyss of stuckness. And it's because diversity includes all of us. This is a shared responsibility. If we're to move this work forward, we have to be able to partner. We have to learn from each other, identify those promising practices. And you know, it's funny, when I was I'm learning so much about the Mizzou and Kansas KU rivalry. I know a lot about the Michigan-Ohio State rivalry, but I also recognize, and Jim noted that at the end, it's just amazing work going on at those institutions, and how can we collaborate? I'm convinced. I was, after the Grax-Rutter legal decisions back in the day, I was a finalist for a position at Michigan, and I promise you 90% of my interview questions asked me, how do you think you're going to handle the fact that you're a graduate of Ohio State coming to Michigan? In fact, they took me on a tour and they took me to their big blue stadium, and they made me stand there for 10 minutes and they said, well, what feelings is this evoking? So I get it. I mean, this is serious stuff. I'm convinced I didn't get the job because that doggone Ohio State. So, but this work does really involve all of us, and how do we leverage that opportunity? I'm close to ending now, but I want to share this video, which I think just typifies the importance of this work and the value of the work that you do. And I think that's our wonderful opportunity, right? It doesn't matter if we're talking about online, traditional spaces, professional and continuing education. How do we provide these wonderful opportunities for those taking those courses to engage, that causes them to step a bit outside their comfort zone and realize the wonderful thing that awaits them. So I kind of end with this kind of journey quote in the kind of wonderful words of that rapper Drake, right? Sometimes it's a journey that teaches you a lot about your destination. And you know, I'm hoping I'm sparking interest for you to really be thinking intentionally about this work. But remember, you know, as you engage in this, I mean, if your plan A doesn't work and you're kind of grappling with it, just remember there's more letters in the alphabet, right? And if the plan doesn't change, if the plan doesn't work, change the plan, but never the goal to ultimately impact our students. And let me end with this story, so that typifies this. So how many of you remember maybe some of your early kind of dating experiences? Good or bad, right? Any boy, I'm not going to call on you, I promise. It's okay to raise your hand, right? I'm going to expose myself in this story. So you remember probably in that experience, right? You in that time probably wanted to showcase something that you thought you did well, right? It didn't matter if it was culinary skills or maybe you fixed things well, whatever it was, you kind of wanted to showcase something that kind of showed the value of your worth, right? And so that was no different for me and some of my initial dating experiences. I remember going on a particular date. I like to sing, right? And so I remember going on this date, and I said, man, if an opportunity comes for me, you know, while maybe a song is playing in the radio, maybe I can just, you know, hum a few bars and maybe she'll recognize, hey, I'm a catch, you know what I mean? And so, so I had this all worked out, and I thought it was really perfect. And so a song comes on the radio, Luther Vandross. How many of you know Luther Vandross? He's probably top 5 R&B singer, and he had a song, House Is Not a Home Any, and so it was a part of the song where it said, when I climb the stairs and turn the key, saying that you're still in love, still in love, still in love with, I like to do that dip when still in love with me, yeah, yeah. Now listen, American Idol wasn't out, right? The Voice wasn't out. But I'm thinking I'm at least semifinal worthy. I'm thinking at least Adam Levine, somebody's turning around a chair for me, right? Well, my date, you know, she asked me, so who sings that song? And I said, it's an opportunity. How do you not know? This is Luther Vandross, you know, the only top 5 R&B singer. She said, okay. She said, last time I checked, that was a solo and not a duet. You might want to leave that up to Luther next time, right? And so I had to, clearly my plan didn't work, so I had to change the plan. But my goal was the same, right? I wanted that second date. I wanted to see if this could last a little longer, and clearly I figured something out because we've been married 21 years. So as you go forward in this work, stay the course. If I can be a resource to UPCEA, please leverage me, but there are some amazing people doing this work on your respective campuses. I know that, and I think we're committed to having wonderful cross-functional partners like you to move this work forward. So with that, I just want to say thank you.